I rehearsed the casual walk to Claire's until the path felt ordinary. Soft shoes, a light smile, the air of someone running an errand. I pressed the bell because I wanted to see, with my own eyes, the life he'd been hiding. The door opened, and for a dizzy instant I expected a stranger. Instead, Martin stood there, hair combed, shirt neat, a smile that knew how to charm judges and neighbors. He held a bouquet like a prop, as if his perfumed politeness could iron out his choices. He looked at me with the same calm he used to ask for forgiveness, and never meant it. My pulse steadied, my voice did not. I was not there to beg. I was there to witness what he had traded and to count the cost of everything he thought he could hide. But before I tell you the rest of what happened, I'd love to know where you're watching from, your city or your country. I enjoy hearing that because it reminds me that every home, no matter how far away, carries its own stories too. I had become a careful woman by habit and by necessity. Decades of keeping lists, bills to pay, students to grade, anniversaries to remember, teach you that nothing of consequence survives chaos. So when a stray envelope addressed in my husband's tidy script found its way into my hands, I did what I always had. I made notes. Claire's house was a neat thing on a small street, rows of lavender and clipped boxwood like punctuation. I drove past it twice at first, because there is a difference between seeing and observing. A woman who has made peace with the familiar learns to notice what changes quietly. On the second pass, I wrote down the sinewy detail that would matter later. The license plate of the blue sedan parked on the curb. The time a gardener came with a van. The way its curtains were always closed by late afternoon. I began to map her days. Thursdays were the market day, the one where vendors set up canopies near the wharf, and Claire, I learned, bought bread from a stand that liked a slow conversation. Tuesdays, a delivery from a florist came at noon. Saturday mornings had the washing line full of perfect linens. Sundays, the blinds opened to a generous light as if the household expected church. Patterns are what make people legible. Olivia from next door was an ally I had not expected to need. She had watched the street with the same curate's patience as her begonias. "They keep to themselves," she said when I first asked. But I noticed things. The man with the beard brings parcels, the lady. She walks with a cane sometimes. There's a small boy who visits on school holidays. Why do you ask? I folded my hands like a teacher and told a small, precise truth. I was checking the neighborhood because some male had turned up with a second name. Who else knew? She brought me a faded image 2 days later. A porch with 2 cups, a ring of sun on the step, and in the background, a blurred figure moving away. It smelled of small towns. You show a photograph, someone remembers a face. It was not a smoking gun, but a proof that other people's small moments intersect. I slipped the image into my notebook like a pressed leaf and kept planning. There is a discipline to watching. I learned to keep my presence ordinary. The right hat, a bag of groceries that made me seem a neighbor running errands, rather than a woman staking out a life. I noted deliveries without staring. When a gardener left a business card tucked into the mailbox, I pocketed it. When a pizza arrived with a name I recognized, someone who works at the marina, I struck that name through and added it to another list. Each line became a stitch. On a gray Wednesday, I followed the blue sedan beyond the turn and saw it stop near the old post office where Martin sometimes met friends for coffee. It was a small risk. Being caught tailing your husband's car carries the cheap thrill of private detectives in novels, but I stayed until I saw Martin step out, hat in hand, speaking to a woman I did not know. He smiled the way men smile when they think they can manage 2 lives at once, an expression meant to disarm and to conceal. The sight lodged in me like a stone in a shoe. It refused to go away. I took a photo from a careful distance. The man and woman did not notice. People who hide do so in broad daylight. They assume invisibility with a kind of arrogance. The photograph ended up on my phone, a small evidence with a timestamp. Later, when Martin asked where I had been that morning, I said I had been at the market and let the omission rest with the small weight of truth. Lying to a liar is a strange craft, less urgent than the slow architecture of method. Who did he think he was fooling? I did not want to stagger into a confrontation without a net. Plans need scaffolding. So I built mine with ordinary things: a coffee-stained receipt, a name on a pizza box, a gardener's telephone number, and a photo of a blue sedan with a license I could match to a registration. I learned to read the margins of other people's days, the time the gardener called at 8:07, the name on a delivery slip. All of it became parts of a map that pointed to one house and two lives. At night, I sat with a list and circled the corners where proof might be incontrovertible. What would make a neighbor believe and a stranger accept? A signature, a joint envelope, a photograph that did not blur the edges, a piece of paper that read Martin and Claire with an address in clear handwriting. That would be the kind of object that does not depend on gossip. It was not elegant, but it would be clear. There is a small cruelty in planning. You teach yourself how to hold your cool. I practiced my patience like a muscle. I told myself the work was not revenge, but inventory. Names, times, receipts, photographs. Inventory is the neutral language of adults. It contains anger in stationery. When the plan grew enough to be held in one hand, I began to enact the small social cunning that keeps questions out of sight until they must be answered. I rang their bell once, at an hour I judged to be quiet. A curtain twitched, and a child's laugh threw sunlight across a window. The door did not open. I left a small package, tea, a polite note about the neighborhood, and watched the woman across the porch lift it as I drove away. It was a test disguised as civility. If she noticed the handwriting, what would she do? If she did not, what would the omission mean? That night I received a text from an unknown number. "Thanks for the tea. Sorry I missed you." Would they answer the door? The next act was to plant a bait that would force their hands. I ordered a delivery, a small framed print with a generic inscription, and set it to arrive addressed to both of them. It was an awkward little provocation, like leaving a lemon under a door to see who smells it. The courier photo that came to my inbox showed Martin's face, briefly, as he signed. The image was grainy, but it had the arc of truth, a signature, the day's date, the address. I printed it and slid it beside my notebook. A friend suggested I recruit a witness who could stand by what they'd seen. I asked Olivia to watch on a particular afternoon and to keep her phone ready. She obliged because she liked the way order restored itself when a neighbor tended to a wrong. She took a short video of two figures at the gate, Martin handing an envelope to Claire, and sent it to me with only one word. Now. The file loaded like the clack of a final domino. It contained movement, presence, and the small cowardice of a man moving under ordinary light. I could see the trap taking shape. With the video and the courier's photo and the gardener's card, my map felt less hypothetical and more like a case. I began to plan the language I would use, the coolness of my tone, the exact place where I would stand. I practiced sentences that sounded less like accusation and more like authority. I am not a woman easily undone by spectacle. I prefer the quiet architecture of proof. There are moments when a plan feels ethical, and others when it feels like survival. This crossed that line. I would not humiliate for pleasure. I would not break to make him fall. I would prepare a kind of confrontation that left little room for his polished evasions. When the time came, I would stand on a doorstep and demand an accounting. The map was my instrument, the neighborhood my chorus. I closed the notebook and taped the courier photo to the inside of the cover. The little pieces of evidence were not dramatic. They were receipts, images, names. But they had a geometry that made excuses smaller. I slept with the faint calm of someone who had measured her next steps and knew the route. Something moved in the street that evening, as if to answer me. A van backing away, a thud of a gate closing, the muffled sound of a radio. I thought of the bell on Claire's door and felt the old, precise thrill, a readiness that was not malice, but the careful expectation of a reckoning. I would ring soon enough. I had learned that the architecture of a trap is more patient than the flash of revenge. A bait must look unintentional, domestic, something a neighbor might leave because they care. So I ordered a framed print. Nothing precious, just a coastal sketch with a generic inscription, and set the delivery for late morning, when the house would be most likely awake, but not alarmed. The courier would photograph the signature upon delivery, and that photograph would be proof he had signed in person. Small things like a courier's timestamp anchor a story to a moment. They make excuses shrink. I practice my face for chance encounters. I wanted to appear kind, perhaps slightly forgetful, a woman who leaves gifts for new neighbors. When the driver called to say he was outside, I was already arranging groceries into my bag, the sort of ordinary chore that dissolves suspicion. I watched from across the street as Martin emerged, hat in hand, and clipped the proof of delivery with a gentleman's calm. He signed without checking the recipient's name too closely. Habits matter. And the grainy courier photo arrived in my inbox like a small bell of truth. Planting a bait is theater without violence. The point is to let the other actors reveal themselves. Martin came and took the parcel. The photo showed his hand on the manifest. Later, I received the courier's returning image, a signature that matched his scrawl. I printed the image and slid it into my notebook next to the gardener's card and the shot of the blue sedan. My case was taking shape. Timestamp, delivery, licensing, a geometry that would be hard to explain away. Yet I wanted more than one photograph. I wanted a sequence, movement that might survive the soft slipperiness of denial. So I arranged another ordinary thing, a repairman's visit. I called a small local handyman and asked that he drop by Claire's that afternoon for a leak. The man was practical and mildly curious. He would, I knew, collect a receipt and perhaps a short note. He left the business card in the mailbox. I tucked it into my pocket the moment he drove away. This was not malicious. It was a careful accumulation of ordinary proofs. I also needed voices. Olivia, for all her begonias, agreed to be my human camera. She would water her plants at the time I suggested and, without staring, film the gate. Her phone would capture faces and gestures harmlessly. Neighbors recording for safety is not odd in a small town. On the day she filmed, the clip showed Martin leaning into Claire's porch as a man might lean into a conversation he thought private. He pressed something small into her hand. She tucked it into her pocket as if the motion were routine. The clip loaded and played like an indictment. That evening I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and drafted the first of many calm messages. I would not storm doors. I would question like someone reading an inventory. I typed a small, polite text to Claire under the pretense of neighborliness. Hi, I left a print for you earlier. Hope it arrived. I'm Evelyn from 2 doors down. The reply came with a promptness that suggested politeness and maybe pleasure. Thank you so much, Evelyn. Martin helped me bring it inside. It was the kind of small confirmation that felt like a notch on a measuring stick. I wanted proof of intent, not merely presence. So I planted a small, deliberate error that would force Martin's hand. I arranged for a registered letter to be delivered in the morning, addressed to both of them, with a return receipt required. A certified delivery leaves official marks. When a person signs for such a parcel, they provide not only a name, but an administrative trace. The postman's photo arrived, and there it was. Martin's signature on the docket. Martin's initials on the return card. Paper is stubborn in a way that confession is not. Between these stage props, the courier's photo, Olivia's clip, the registered mail, I also prepared for conversation. I rehearsed a tone that would not flare into accusation, but would place the burden of explanation on him. I must have misread the envelope, I would say. I want to understand. The gentleness is a kind of blade. It makes the other reveal their own evasions. I had been a teacher long enough to know how to ask the right questions. Then there were the digital crumbs. In the quiet of my study, I logged onto the local community forums and scanned for footprints. People talk without intending to. A complacent brag or a careless comment can be a confession. I found a post, a photo of Martin at a market with a woman I suspected, tagged with a location and an offhand comment about shared tastes. Screenshots do the slow work of memory. I saved the posts, dated them, and printed them. The paper archive grew, a collage of small exposures, each unremarkable on its own, together pregnant with meaning. A practical question remained. What would I do if Claire was innocent? The plan had to be reversible in a way, capable of exposing a liar, but not of devouring an innocent woman. I believed Claire's culpability would reveal itself in the pattern. Responsibility lies where patterns repeat. If she protested genuinely, if she was truly deceived, the narrative would shift to a shared betrayal, and my target would remain Martin. I had no appetite for dragging a woman into ruin who had been misled. On a cool Thursday, I put the pieces together. I printed the courier image at high resolution, clipped the registered card into the folder, and transcribed Olivia's short video onto paper. I drafted a calm letter to Martin. I dropped something off at Claire's. There are a few things that need explaining. The letter was not dramatic. It aligned the facts. I mailed it with a return receipt. He would receive a note, and the note would carry all the weight of an unasked question. My plan also had procedural backups. I visited the town clerk's office in the morning under the guise of renewing a library card and asked casually about property records on Claire's street. A clerk, accustomed to nosy citizens, gave me the basics: ownership name, a date of purchase, and an address. That was the lattice I needed. If Martin tried to claim coincidence, the lattice would not bend. There is a moral precision to preparing a case. It is not fueled by the sputter of emotion, but by the certainty of facts. I scheduled my movements so I would be in proximity when the registered parcel delivered and when Olivia's short clip would show activity. These were small contingencies, not traps in the cruel sense, but actions that would allow truth to show its face. When the day arrived, the postman's image loaded, Olivia's clip pinged, and my phone filled with the kind of evidence that does not plead: signatures, timestamps, moving images. As the net closed, I felt a calm, unfamiliar, and necessary. The work was not about spectacle. It was about holding him to a ledger. I would confront at a time and place of my choosing, with witnesses and paper at my side. The trap was set not to injure, but to reveal. I brewed a fresh pot of tea and waited for the next act to begin. I had rehearsed my lines, and now the stage would finally be ready. There was a crucial, quieter work I could not skip: rehearsing the face I would wear when the door opened. I wanted contained surprise, not a shout, questions that sounded like curiosity, not accusation. I practiced lines in the mirror. I must have misread the envelope. Could you help me understand? The cadences were chosen to let evasions slip. A neighbor handed me a small scrap, an installer's note with a date. I called the number and received a calm confirmation. Someone had fitted a lock at Claire's earlier that week for Martin's place. Tradespeople speak in facts, not gossip, and that fact joined the others like a quiet witness. At night, I spread the materials on my dining table: courier photo, registered card, Olivia's clip, the gardener's card, printed screenshots. I labeled each item carefully. The act of arranging evidence steadied me. It turned anger into method. I did not plan spectacle. I planned clarity. The day before, I rehearsed my path to Claire's door in sensible shoes and kept my movements ordinary. If he tried to vanish the evidence, the registered delivery and the courier timestamps would remain. When the parcel's image arrived and the postman's return showed a signature, I felt the map tighten. The trap was no longer hypothetical. I did not rush. Patience is its own instrument. I waited for the right moment to knock and for the right witnesses to be present. Proof, not fury, would be my tool. The door opened before my knock had finished, and for a blink I saw the familiar photograph in real life. Martin's practiced smile, the bouquet in his hand, Claire standing just behind him with a neutral expression. The porch smelled of lilies and lemon polish. A child rode past. A neighbor pretended to prune roses. Secrets are clumsy in public. I spoke first. "Good morning," I said, even and small. "I left a print across the street earlier. I wondered if it arrived." Martin's eyes flicked to my bag and then to Claire, measuring which story would fit. He stepped aside with a polite bow. "Evelyn," he said, "come in." I did not enter. The porch is a public ledger. I kept my coat on. I set the papers on the rail: courier photo, registered mail card, Olivia's transcription, the sort of things one might lay out to compare receipts. Martin's smile narrowed as soon as he saw the manifest. The grainy courier image showed a hand signing. The registered card bore initials. The geometry of evidence began to close. Claire's composure trembled. "Is there a problem?" she asked, watching Martin for guidance. He tried the practiced line: "We're just friends." But the street listens. A denial in the open sounds like theater. I pressed play on Olivia's clip and held the phone so the porch could see. Martin, at the gate, pressing something into Claire's hand. It was nothing flashy, an exchange of small courtesies, but repetition makes patterns. Signature, timestamp, a video loop. People around us shifted. A young man from the corner who'd posted a video earlier stepped forward. "I saw them sign," he said. "There was a little celebration." His plain sentence turned private acts into public facts. Martin fumbled for an explanation. "It's not what you think," he said. He pulled an envelope from his pocket with the practiced flourish of someone who keeps paperwork for contingencies. Inside was a certificate with names and a date. "We had a civil ceremony," he said. I read the date aloud because a date is a small judge. The street became a jury. Claire's face broke in a way that made me think she might be deceived rather than complicit. "I thought it was a promise," she told us. "He told me he was divorced." Her voice crumpled. The nuance bent the moral frame, but did not erase the fact of the paper in my hand. Then a car turned down the lane. An older man, Claire's legal husband, returned early from a trip, stopped at the curb. He did not shout. He stood with his phone, the steadiness of someone who is learning a betrayal. His presence changed the scene from scandal to consequence. Martin looked smaller, the polished edges of his composure gone. He asked Claire to speak for him. She hesitated and then said, "I didn't know." The neighbors murmured. The man at the curb asked Martin quietly, "Is this true?" Martin's denial cracked into a series of excuses. Words like complicated and lonely spilled out, and they had no legal weight in the face of signatures and timestamps. People began to take out phones. "There's a live feed," someone said. The speed of rumor startled me. Truth now moved on screens. I closed my notebook with the papers inside and felt the calm of someone who had prepared evidence rather than drama. Before the moment could devolve into shouting, I asked the simple administrative question that ties stories to law. "Where is the record filed?" Martin produced a grainy scan of what he claimed was a registry seal. A local man confirmed he'd seen a small celebration, and the postman's timestamp had been recorded. The facts gathered like weather. Martin's pleading voice changed tone. "Evelyn, please," he begged. "Let me explain. Don't do anything rash." His request was less a plea than a bargaining chip in public. I kept my voice level. "Explain," I said. He began to talk about promises, confusion, loneliness, phrases that sound like confession but are thin against stamped dates and signatures. At that moment, the legal husband walked up the path and faced Martin. He did not shout. He folded his arms and said simply, "You made promises to my wife." The sentence landed. The neighborhood leaned in. For a small town, a simple sentence can be an instrument of consequence. I did not gloat. There is a narrow line between revelation and cruelty, and I intended only to exact record, not revenge for its own sake. While Martin scrambled for language, I watched the faces around us. Mrs. Harper from the bakery had come to the fence, hand to mouth. The boy who had posted the clip stood proud and awkward. A woman from 2 doors down crossed her arms and said, "About time someone called it out." Neighbors are small town's jury and memory. Claire's denial shifted into something sharper when the neighbor who'd uploaded a clip confirmed he'd also seen a small celebration on the lawn. "They signed papers," he said. "There were a few people." The sentence sealed more than confirmation. It moved a private script into public record. I asked for the registrar's number and someone dialed. The clerk answered calmly and said records could be checked that afternoon if filed in the county. Bureaucracy is an antiseptic in matters of rumor. Martin's script of private ceremony faltered against the prospect of an official check. "It was private," he pleaded, "not filed." The clerk's presence as possibility made the claim sound evasive. Martin tried charm, jokes, little asides aimed at Mrs. Harper, and the motion felt feeble. The presence of Claire's husband, steady as a column, turned the tableau from gossip into civic business. That change is important. When an affair crosses into administrative territory, it invites lawyers and ledgers, not whispers. Phones were already posting the clip. Someone muttered they'd put it on the local group. The speed of modern witness surprised me, though I had expected it. Evidence travels faster than discretion. I folded the courier image back into its sleeve and clipped the registered card on top. The trap had done its work. Signatures, timestamp, a video, a witness, and the presence of a legal spouse. As the crowd thinned, the registrar called back. There was indeed a filed record under Martin's name in another county. Paper had weight. Signatures had bearings. Martin's excuses slackened like rope cut mid-pull. Claire's eyes filled with a grief that had something like betrayal and something like bewilderment. Before leaving the porch, I said what I had rehearsed. Not a sermon, but a line that turns private betrayal into public responsibility. If it is a mistake, I said, prove it at the town office. If not, we will let the law and the neighbors keep the accounts. There was no theatrical glee in my voice, only the clear tone of someone who has turned feeling into action. I walked away with the folder under my arm, the small bell of my phone still chiming. Neighbors called for the registrar and for a solicitor. The scene would ripple, calls to lawyers, requests for documents, and the slow work of inventory that follows exposure. The trap had held. Now the ledger would be drawn taut. This was the pivot, from discovery at a doorstep to consequence through law and record. I had learned that towns have two languages, the one people use to be pleasant and the one the courthouse understands. The morning after the confrontation, I dressed as I always do for work, simple, unremarkable, and walked into the lawyer's office with my folder under my arm. Mr. Hale met me in the small reception area, his hair thinner than I remembered, and his hands as steady as his tone. "You brought copies," he said, and I set the packet on his desk. Courier photo, registered return card, Olivia's clip transcribed, the gardener's card, the registrar's preliminary confirmation, and the neighbor's sworn note. He read the documents without surprise. Lawyers see patterns of human failure. They keep a vocabulary for it. "We can act on several fronts," he said. "First, we secure temporary relief, prevent him from moving assets or dissipating funds. Second, we subpoena any bank records that show transfers. Third, if he contracted a marriage while still legally married to you, we can pursue criminal charges for bigamy and file for annulment of that second union." He made it procedural, the way a surgeon lists instruments, and the list steadied me. Moving forward felt like turning the pages of a ledger that would force truth into arithmetic. Mr. Hale prepared a package, a petition for emergency orders, an affidavit laying out the evidence, a request for a temporary injunction to freeze transfers of marital funds, and an application for exclusive use and possession of the marital residence pending resolution. He explained patiently, "We must show a credible risk that he will dissipate assets or alter records." The courier photo with a timestamp, the registered return card bearing his signature, and Olivia's visual record were not theatrical details. They were the spine of proof. We agreed to subpoena bank records and payment histories. Mr. Hale called a contact at the bank, Mr. Bennett, someone I had met socially once, who listened with the administrative calm of a man who moves money for a living. "If there's rapid transfer activity," he said, "we can flag accounts and hold funds pending court direction." The voice of a bank manager is not a public shout. It is an administrative closure that makes runaways stop. Claire's legal husband filed an affidavit that afternoon. He brought a ring he had found in a drawer and a photograph of the small ceremony on the lawn. His presence turned rumor into a layered claim. This was not merely a lover's quarrel, but a web of commitments with legal bearings. His affidavit added weight to our filings and showed how many lives this one man's choices had affected. We filed in county that day. The clerks took our papers. Affidavits sworn, petitions stamped and docketed. Filing for emergency relief is oddly ritualistic. Signatures, counters, a clerk's small nod. But there is power in ritual. The judge on duty, after a very short reading, agreed to an expedited hearing and issued a temporary restraining order on specific accounts and assets listed in our petition. The order was not a final decree. It was a pause. It told Martin, and anyone who might help him move funds, that the money could not leave the ledger without court permission. The bank, having received our subpoena and the judge's interim order, flagged several transfers that were suspicious and put temporary holds on withdrawals. Mr. Bennett called to confirm. "We've frozen the transfers, Ms. Carter. The funds remain in place. We will await further instructions from the court." The administrative voice felt like a quiet hand closing a door on his options. Martin reacted as men with something to hide often do. He moved quickly and then clumsily. He combed through old filing boxes, printed statements, and scribbled down account numbers as if paperwork could rewrite consequence. He sent me messages asking for a meeting and at one point showed up at my door with a face arranged for contrition. The petition had turned his charm into a thin instrument. It didn't work in stamped silence. I listened to him offer fragments of explanation. I kept the folder closed and my replies measured. Paper requires more than words. We also sought a court order that prevented either spouse from selling or transferring titled property, an injunction on real estate that, in effect, closed the option of a quick liquidation. Mr. Hale explained the mechanics. With the judge's order filed, county clerks will not record transfers if challenged by the pending docket. Banks will not release funds without judicial permission. It felt like watching the machinery of adult life slow down around a man who had assumed he could always outrun consequence. The prosecutor's office, alerted by Claire's husband's complaint, opened a preliminary inquiry. Bigamy is not always charged in modern life. Often the remedy is civil. But where a man presents himself as married to two women with signatures and ceremonies, the criminal code still exists to name the fact of duplicity. An investigator asked me to provide my marriage certificate and the copies we'd obtained against Martin. I gave the documents as carefully as someone hands over a long-held photograph. That week, a constable came to serve Martin with the order. The sight of an officer walking up his path felt more ordinary than seismic, but ordinary is the legal machine's preferred theater. He was calm when he read the order aloud. Accounts frozen, no transfers allowed, a hearing scheduled, an admonition that violation could lead to contempt charges. The paper told the small drama that neighbors could see. The law now watched the man who had once watched others. He attended the emergency hearing. Courtrooms have a vocabulary: the bench, the docket, the clerk's small stamps. I sat with Mr. Hale and heard, as a teacher might enjoy, the precise clarifications the judge ordered. Temporary injunctive relief is not dramatic to read. It is a list of constraints, but it turns the world into a ledger someone must answer. The judge ordered disclosure of financial statements, set deadlines for account production, and scheduled a further hearing after the registrar produced certified records. Outside the courthouse doors, the town had its own jury. People spoke in low voices, some with sympathy, others with a sober satisfaction that the ledger was closing. The men who had once waved to Martin at the cafe began to nod to me with a different respect. A neighbor slipped a note into my bag that read, "You did it the right way." That small civilian approval was not spectacle, but recognition that I had taken the careful route. Martin's bluster continued in quieter forms. Hurried attempts to cajole Claire, requests for private mediation, an email to old friends asking for discretion. The freeze on accounts hampered what he could do. He tried to transfer small sums through a friend. Those instruments were frozen by bank holds and subpoenas. The legal net was not flawless, but it was thorough. And people who think charm is a currency soon find themselves dealing in ledgers and subpoenas. There was a private, sharp moment when he realized the cost. He stood in the kitchen with a handful of letters, mortgage notices, registration renewals, and asked, in a voice thin with something like real fear, "Eve, what do you want?" I had been patient enough and precise enough to craft an answer that was both simple and final. "I want an accounting," I said. "I want the law to decide what is ours and what is not." The words were not a flourish. They were a demand for paper. By week's end, the temporary orders held. The bank freezes remained in place. The prosecutor had opened a file and asked for further information. The judge's docket had a date that would mark the next stage. Martin paced in the margins of those dates like someone who had run out of rehearsals. There was still a danger that he would attempt a last quiet maneuver through a friend or through some clever nominal transfer. That was why subpoenas had been broad and why we had the bank's cooperation. Institutions move slower than people, but their friction is often enough to make the hurried pause and the cunning reconsider. I found a small satisfaction in that. Law does not need passion, it needs evidence, and evidence is precise. When he called late that night, there was less swagger in his voice and more calculation. "Is there room to negotiate?" he asked, as if he had a last card to play. I thought of the ledger I had assembled, the courier's timestamp, Olivia's clip, Claire's husband's affidavit, the registrar's paper. I thought of the judge's dry voice instructing final disclosures. "There's only room for truth," I said calmly. "Tell it in court." The line went quiet. I closed the folder and felt, as I often felt after teaching a class through its hardest exam, the fatigue of work done well. The legal path is not theatrical. It is a slow, steady tightening of rules that force a man to answer in ways charm never could. I had not wanted destruction. I wanted boundaries. The court's temporary orders had created a boundary that made his choices visible and costly. The next hearing would move us from freeze to final accounting. That, finally, would determine whether he lost fortunes or only the pretense of them, and whether the neighbors would remember him as he had been, or only as the man who learned to measure charm against ledgers. The hearing felt like a long, dry afternoon made of lists. Paper after paper was read aloud. Bank statements, transfer records, the registrar's certified copy of that second ceremony. I sat in the third row with my folder, and the courthouse smelled of lemon oil on the bench and the small antiseptic dignity that comes whenever a town decides to measure a man according to his paperwork rather than his charm. Martin arrived with a suit that said he expected ceremony to save him. He sat with his hands folded, a man making himself useful as a prop. His lawyer rattled through objections and offered explanations, some technical, some sentimental, the kind men recite when the formal world demands them. But judges prefer chronology. They want dates and numbers. They want timestamps. They want signatures. We had them. The bank's compliance officer testified with a ledger printed across her lap. She walked the bench through transfers that took place in the weeks after our first notice, withdrawals routed through a shell LLC, small wire transfers to accounts listed under vendor names, attempts to move titles to nominee parties. The voice of administrative fact is not loud. It is meticulous, and meticulousness has a way of wearing down a performance. Each line she read shortened the distance between his practiced smile and the awkwardness of a man being tallied. At one point, Martin rose and spoke directly to the court. His voice carried the old cadence of charm. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said, as though hurt were an accident in some other person's file. He described loneliness, confusion, the human desire for warmth. He looked to Claire's husband in the front row, and for a second, there was something like apology in his eyes. That second did not change the arithmetic of signatures. The judge paused and asked a quiet, administrative question. Had any transfers been made with the intent to frustrate creditors or conceal assets? The compliance officer's answer was unambiguous. "There are transfers that appear structured to avoid detection," she said. The judge's face did not become a gavel. It became something colder, an instrument of decision. "Given the record and the apparent risk of dissipation," he said, "this court will convert the temporary freeze to a preliminary preservation order pending final accounting. Further, I will authorize forensic accounting as requested by petitioners." Language like preliminary preservation order is not dramatic in a novelistic way. It is instrumental. It means locks and sealed files and the practical prevention of flight. It means lawyers crawling through ledgers until the truth is expressed in dollar signs and deeds. It felt to me like steady work done in daylight. Outside the courtroom, the town hummed with a different currency. People who'd once greeted Martin at the corner bakery now kept a distance. The cafe owner who had given him credit for a free cup for years asked, when he happened by the shop, if he could still be trusted with tabs. The small humiliations were not public spectacles so much as the slow reconfiguration of daily courtesy. Reputation is not simply reputation. It is credit. It is friendliness. It is the difference between a man who sits at a table and a man who sits alone. Claire's husband filed for dissolution that week. He was composed. There was resolved grief in his voice when he spoke to the clerk, and the county processed his affidavit with the mechanized efficiency of legal endings. Claire, who had come to the courthouse to answer questions and then stayed to speak in soft, cracked sentences, declined to support Martin's efforts to mediate privately. "There is a breach here I can't reconcile," she told a mediator later. "He gave me promises that were not his to give." Her rejection was not spectacular, but it was final in a way that made the public administrative. We continued the accounting. Forensic auditors sifted through ledgers and found patterns that confirmed a principle I had suspected. Access had been shifted. There were accounts with nominal owners, transfers to businesses Martin sometimes used for casual payments, and a pair of transactions that attempted to move title to a small rental in an adjacent county. The auditors traced each path and reported back. The movement looked designed to shelter funds. Where the money went exactly would take time and subpoenas, but the lines were there. When the preliminary order converted to a more binding preservation, a county clerk placed a notice on the deeds so transfers could not be recorded without a judge's sign-off. Banks kept assets on hold. Men who had been willing to do last-minute favors found fewer reasons to oblige when their signatures might be examined later. The legal web tightened in an unceremonious, civil way. Martin's attempts at charm grew thinner. He called people, old friends and business contacts, and the responses were cautious. Some expressed support in private while asking public silence. Others, who depended on reputation and predictable networks, quietly distanced themselves. Where once a call might have brought applause and a favor, now the calls returned measured replies and requests for documentation. Charm does not pay for appraisers and escrow fees. His social life eroded as predictably as frost eating a last rose. The woman who'd once hosted a small book club where Martin had compiled friends now told me she could not host him anymore. "It's awkward," she said. "People expect certain standards." The standards had moved from polite smiling to ledger-ready paperwork, and he had no comfortable way to recalibrate. There was one day I will not forget. He walked the neighborhood in the hazy late light, hands in his pockets, visiting stoops as if seeking the warmth he'd once borrowed. Doors that once opened for him stayed shut. A neighbor who had once waved now asked him for a return of a borrowed drill and then closed the door with a polite firmness. A man he'd coached in lawn care passed without the old chuckle. He became, in the small scale of a street, a man for whom the rituals of belonging had been suspended. The final, formal humiliation came at the second hearing. The court had reviewed the accountant's interim report and found sufficient cause to order a conservative division. Until final adjudication, certain discretionary funds would be sequestered and specific assets listed as subject to plaintiff's claim for restitution. Counsel for Martin argued vehemently, but the ledger, the timing, the signatures, the patterns, proved too stubborn for theatrics. The judge signed an order directing certain account balances to be held in trust, directing inventory of assets, and noting the pending criminal inquiry. It was not a dramatic arrest. It was a removal of privilege. He lost the quiet ability to decide who could be paid and when. With legal restraints in place, people who had once lined up at his door to lend small favors now walked past him without greeting. The town's small economy of goodwill had conditional courtesy written in its margins. He no longer fit the conditions. The second wife, Claire, announced in a small, practical statement that she would return what she could and cooperate with investigators. The man who had once held 2 ceremonies now had neither ceremony nor a home that all parties recognized as undisputed. He tried one last public performance. There was a small charity luncheon he had helped organize the year before. He sat at the back and hoped to be taken in by the circulations of kindness. People politely avoided him. The lunch snipped into its own ease and did not make room. He left before dessert, walking out with his cane tapping the pavement and a shell of composure someone else might once have mistaken for dignity. One afternoon, a week later, I saw him sitting on the bench outside the old hardware store, hands folded, the sun flattening his face into careful lines. He was alone. A car passed and the driver glanced at him, then turned away. A child on a bicycle paused and asked his mother why the man was there. She said nothing and rode on. He looked smaller than he had in anyone's memory because belonging is both public and domestic. Small nods at corners, a neighbor leaving eggs on a doorstep. Those small reciprocities had stopped. I walked by slowly and found I had nothing dramatic to offer. I did not take pleasure in seeing a man reduced to solitude. The work I had done was not about spectacle. It had been about making choices costly and visible. I crossed the street and left him the bag of bread I had bought that morning, folding it so the paper hid the kindness. He looked up, and there was a flicker, something like regret, or maybe just the recognition that the town had turned a page. "Eve," he said, voice rough, "please, I didn't meaning matters less than consequence," I said. My voice had the clarity of a final exam given fairly. "You made promises you had no right to make. The law will decide what is ours. The neighbors will decide where to sit with you. You can start again, but start with honesty." He nodded as if taking a lesson. That is what he had to do now. Rebuild in public, not as a man hiding behind charm, but as a man doing the long, visible work of repair. When the town bulletin printed the formal notice of the preservation order and the upcoming settling hearing, the most damaging thing was not the headline, but the conversations that followed it. People updating their mental ledgers, recalculating trust, changing which errands to run for whom. The legal machinery had turned private deceit into civic knowledge. That civic knowledge is the kind that sits in grocery lines and at cafes, the kind that quietly moves choices of company. In the end, Martin was left to learn in small humiliations. His calls returned with formality, invitations dried up, and the easy social currency he had spent so freely was suspended. He did not end up on the street as a spectacle with a placard. He ended up there by the quieter means of social correction. No one invited him in, no one pushed his cart, no one left eggs on his porch. The loneliness was cumulative, an attrition of favors and invitations. I did not gloat at his emptiness. That is a bad sort of victory. What I felt was something steadier, a confidence that boundaries had been restored and that the community had seen a man measured by his actual commitments. I had wanted accounting, not cruelty. I had wanted him to answer in law and in neighborliness for what he had traded. That evening I sat at my kitchen table and placed the certificate, the small paper with a date, into a drawer. I did not burn it or throw it like a trophy. I filed it as evidence that I had demanded a ledger and been given one. The house felt ordinary again. Tea kettle, low light, the sort of ordinary that is clean and steady. I had my life back in the way that matters most. The small daily courtesies returned, the morning walks restored, the knowledge that the home I had built would not be bargained away in the dark. When I passed Claire in the lane a week later, she looked up and managed a small, complicated smile. There was no great reconciliation, only a mutual acknowledgement of how flimsy some truths can be and how durable others must be made. We did not exchange many words. There was no need. The work had been done in paperwork and in the town's slow remembering. As for Martin, he had to learn the arithmetic of repair. Not all will forgive, and some doors will remain closed. That is the price of choices. But I make a small concession. I left him the chance to work in public, to be seen making amends if he wanted to. That is mercy with a ledger. The empty bench outside the hardware store was not my vengeance. It was the town's response when a man confuses appetite for belonging with entitlement. I stood at my kitchen window that night and listened to the gulls. The house was quiet, and the quiet felt like a boundary kept. The ledger closed for now, but not forever. He could build himself again, but this time under the light. There is a small domestic mercy in endings that are neither theatrical nor vengeful, the way the ordinary returns when the ledger is finally balanced. After the hearings and the freezes and the slow accounting, the house walked back into its rhythms. Cups left on the counter, curtains opened in the morning, a neighbor waving from the gate. Those were the restitutions I cared about most, the daily courtesies that say quietly, "This place will not be bargained away again." I did not dance on Martin's ruin. I watched him learn what it means to be accountable in public. Subpoenas answered, transfers explained or returned, days spent under the hum of an auditor's lamp. He lost the easy arc of invitations and the private comforts that charm had bought him. He found, in their place, blanks, closed doors and measured replies. There was a loneliness to it, not theatrical but precise, and I felt no appetite to amplify it. Justice, when done by law and by neighbors, is its own teacher. Claire and I did not become friends overnight. We exchanged a few careful sentences in the lane and a nod that held more than civility. It held acknowledgement. She had been part of the story. So had I. We both left the record where it belonged, in the clerk's files, and in the town's slow memory. That was enough. When people ask if I felt triumphant, I answer that I felt restored. A woman's life is not an accessory to be promised away. It is the architecture of small things: a kettle, a chair, a morning walk. I reclaimed what mattered in the only ways that matter, by insisting on clarity, by using law when words were not enough, and by letting consequence do the work of correction. If this story mattered to you, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and why you clicked this story.